Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ITSS Members Series podcast. My name is Joshua Yao, and I'm joined by Olivia Tollis from the Crimes, Extremism, and Terrorism team. So today we have the pleasure of having Mr. Michael Burgoyne on the topic of America's designation of Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Mr. Burgoyne is an assistant professor of practice within the International Security Studies MA program at the University of Arizona's School of Government and Public Policy, with a research focus on insurgency and transnational organized crime. As a retired U.S. Army colonel, Mr. Burgoyne has extensive experience in the field, including his role as a counterinsurgency trainer at the National Training Center, assignments as the Army attaché in Mexico, and policy analyst at the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. So welcome, Mr. Burgoyne. Now for our first question. What are the potential implications of this designation for the structure and operations of organized crime networks in Mexico?
Yes, I think unfortunately we're not going to see a major change in the structure or the operations of these groups in Mexico. At the root of the problem, you've got this domestic market in the United States, and that's what drives the creation of these organizations and how they function and why they exist. And this terrorist designation really goes after the supply side of these groups, which it's done for a long time. That's really been the U.S. war on drug policy. And so I think if you're not going after the domestic problem, if you're not going after the user base, if you're not going after like how these people, like why people in the United States are using drugs, even if you target these groups, whether you call them terrorists, whether you call them, drug traffickers, they're still going to be there and there's still going to be a problem and more will pop up. So I don't think you're going to see major changes in the structure of these organizations or how they operate just because of the terrorist organization. The other thing that I think is interesting about this, that you could have seen some kind of positive results or changes in the way they operate or changes in their organization if you had targeted like one particular organization. Like if you said, well, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the CJNG, okay, this is a terrorist organization. And so we're going to apply pressure on one group. And that allows the Mexican government to apply pressure to one group and the United States government to really apply a lot of pressure and apply mass to all these organizations and law enforcement that are going after this one group. If you did that, then potentially you could see a change in the way groups operate, because then they'd have one group that they saw receiving different treatment because it is a terrorist organization. Unfortunately, the Trump administration is really what they've decided is they're like, well, okay, we're going to go ahead and designate so many of these groups. So you've got, CJNG, Sinaloa, and the Sinaloa cartel is fractured right now, essentially in a civil war. And then you've got some other groups that are kind of like, it doesn't make a ton of sense, where you have things like the Gulf Cartel. And like the Gulf Cartel is, it's kind of a shell of what it used to be, and it is also extremely fractured. And there's lots of these very smaller kind of subcomponents of the Gulf Cartel, if you even want to call it the Gulf Cartel. So it becomes kind of confusing as to who's actually being designated here within that group. And then you have these other kind of conglomerations, like Carteles Unidas, which is kind of like this overarching group of several different organizations. And so which ones of those are actually going to be considered terrorists? And then the other problem here is like, okay, well, these are networked organizations. So then how far into the network do you go? Who's actually a card-carrying member of the group? Who's a terrorist? Who isn't? So all that becomes kind of nebulous. And then I think because of that, you're not going to see these, major changes to how groups operate, because they're all designated. They're all kind of in the same boat. So why change the way you're operating? Something else that's probably worth mentioning with this is also authorities. Like these groups are already under a lot of pressure based on just the normal U.S. drug trafficking authorities. The Kingpin Act, they could already go after their funding. They already had visa restrictions. You could go after them with OFAC. There were lots of different things that you could do to go after drug trafficking organizations. And if you're tied to these organizations, you could be prosecuted. The one kind of addition to these authorities that might be useful and that could cause some changes in how they operate is this idea of material support to terrorism. So now material support to terrorism can be a bit more taxing, or it could come with some more serious charges for some of these folks. So I'll give you an example. I'm talking to you from Tucson, Arizona, near the U.S. border with Mexico, and there's big problems with gun stores selling weapons to straw buyers who then provide the weapons to one of these organizations in Mexico. So if that happens, or when that happens, before you get weapons charges, which are significant, but now you could have a situation where that gun store owner gets charged with material support to terrorism, which can come with, like a 20-year prison sentence that maybe wasn't there before. Same thing can happen. You have a big problem here with like teenagers, like 18-year-olds or even 17-year-olds, getting in their car. They find on the internet this opportunity to make a few $100s by picking up some people near the border. So they get in their car, they drive down to the highway near the border, they pick up some migrants and try to get them to a safe house. And a lot of times they're speeding, they're reckless driving, and if they get caught, they can get arrested for that. They can get some charges. But now, if these migrants are tied to a human smuggling network, you could have a situation where that individual is now being charged with material support to terrorism because they're linked back to this network. So you could see some issues there with who wants to be associated with these groups or what the charges they could face as far as that part of it goes. That could provide some change, but it's just kind of a slight variation on the authorities that already exist. And one thing that's kind of interesting, or that I think people aren't fully understanding, especially in the United States, and also in Mexico, is this idea that if you designate a group a terrorist organization, that makes them eligible, or that makes them a target for the use of military force by the United States. And that's not the case. So the terrorist designation does not come with authorities for the use of military force for the president. And I've explained this to some of my Mexican friends. They're like, oh, does this mean that we're going to see drone strikes and SEAL teams going into Sinaloa or something like this? And I said, well, not by the authorities that come with the terrorist designation. The terrorist designation authorities are pretty similar to what already exists for the narco trafficking authorities. Um, but I guess what it does do is it starts changing the mentality. It starts changing, kind of the way that people think about it. So you start changing kind of the narrative because when you think about narco trafficking, you think about law enforcement, you think about judicial prosecution. When you look at designating a group a terrorist organization, you think about the use of military force. So while it doesn't come with that, it starts to change that narrative. And then what I also tell some of my Mexican friends that are worried about this, they're like, well, okay, that's great. Well, it doesn't come with the authorities. But then I remind them that over many years now, our Congress has ceded a lot of the war-making powers to the presidency. So if the president declares an emergency and launches strikes into Mexico or something like this, there's very little that, I mean, Congress could do something about it, but really he can continue to do this for up to 60 days under the War Powers Act before he has to request support from Congress. And in this case, with the current Congress, I think it's unlikely that you see Congress restricting his use of force. But that's really the only way it's going to stop is if Congress steps in and then restricts the use of funding or makes it illegal for that use of force to happen. But I think at least initially, the presidency has sufficient authorities to do what it needs to do what basically to conduct military strikes if it wanted to, whether it had the terrorist designation or not. So I think just overall, I don't see a lot of change happening for the structure and operations of these organizations. There's some changes due to that terrorist designation, but I don't think I don't know if it's not really a huge game changer, I don't think.
Yeah,
Sure.
definitely. And I can definitely see where the fears come from, with the most recent statement by President Scheinbaum rejecting any unilateral U.S. military intervention in Mexico. And yeah, so I completely see why some of it may be unfounded also. But that actually leads us into the next question, if Olivia would like to take it from here.
Sure. I think it's really interesting that you've mentioned how interlinked these cartels can be in general society. So I'm just wondering how you think this decision might affect Mexico's economic stability, political dynamics, and just the overall security landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're seeing some pressure. It's kind of surprising. Like when I talk to some of my Mexican friends, it's surprising that, at least in the military and the law enforcement, they're feeling like the Mexican government is kind of letting them now go after these organizations in a way that they hadn't before. And, President Claudia Sheinbaum has said she's going to continue her predecessor, President Lopez Obrador's policies. He had this hugs, not bullets, abrazos, no balazos policy, which I think most people that look at this have, believe that that was not a very successful policy for going after these groups. I mean, the idea was to get after the root causes. I don't think that the Sheinbaum administration has completely departed from that. Certainly, they're still saying they're doing that, but this pressure has changed that policy, or at least has made it easier for them to kind of move on from that policy and really kind of go after these groups. And I think, they're getting aggressive with these groups. I think they were probably going to do that anyway, whether this terrorist designation happened or not. You have her head for security, Secretary Garcia Harfuch. He is fairly operationally minded. He has a really strong background in police work, intelligence, and investigations. And I think he was going to do this anyway. But I think the terrorist designation and some of this pressure from the U.S. has allowed him a little more room to run here to go after these groups. So I think you're seeing that. Another example of that is this 29 criminals that they extradited to the United States. Now that also happened through these national security authorities and not necessarily through the normal legal extradition process. So that's another signal that the Mexican government is kind of changing, how it's going after this and kind of and it's showing a bit of a break from what was happening under Lopez Obrador as far as the rule of law and how they're going to engage with the United States and how they're going to engage with this problem set. You see some other things here with how they're organizing the government. Garcia Harfuch also has just announced that he's going to create his own new kind of police force, his own investigative kind of elite police group that he's going to use to go after, these high-level criminal targets. That I think is another change. One of the biggest issues with this Mexican security strategy and how they've organized to go after these groups has been, every 6 years, they have a 6-year presidential term. So every 6 years, they're changing the entire organization. So with Lopez Obrador, he basically disbanded the federal police and then created this National Guard force, the Guardia Nacional. And then that got placed under the Secretariat of National Defense, Defensa. And, and then so now you now have once again, this administration is now going to create this police force, this federal police force. It sounds like Garcia Harfuch is creating something smaller, more elite, and not like a large police force. I think that's probably within reason. If they decide to create another very large police force, this is tended to try to it takes some of the resources and the political ability to build these kind of things. It takes a lot of the air out of the room, right? So we'll see if they try to build this thing into something bigger than he's initially going for. The other thing I think we're looking at is with the Guardia Nacional, with the National Guard, it being under defensa, like all the legal battles are over, the political battles are over, and that thing's going to stay where it is. And I think that's probably a good thing for professionalization, for creating a force that's got kind of a lasting set up there where it kind of knows where it is. It can get the promotion system straight. It can get the training straight. All that professionalism that these federal level forces, law enforcement forces have struggled with. And there's lots of issues with militarization. There's lots of concerns with, well, are we militarizing our police force, militarizing our response? And I think those are valid concerns. But I think really the biggest problem has been just this lack of continuity between the sexennios, between the presidential administrations. And I think, now that you have Claudia Sheinbaum kind of, following up on the same party as Lopez Obrador, that gives her the ability to kind of continue this thing. So we might see some pretty significant improvement in that federal level policing. As far as economics goes, I think you've got, like I talked about the networks and how these networks are very broad, and as far as targeting them as terrorist organizations goes, that can be very problematic. You've also got these issues, with like the avocados and all these things and banking. So with this terrorist designation and the material support of terrorism, economically, this can create problems because so much of Mexico is tied in, either directly or indirectly with these criminal organizations because they have such reach at the local level, state level, federal level throughout the economy, that depending on how you're going to enforce this terrorism designation, there's a lot of leeway there for the United States to start punishing individuals, organizations, businesses, based on whether they want to enforce this linkage to terrorism or not. So that's a potential problem. I don't know how easy that's going to be. That could be one of these kind of things that the Trump administration, if some bank or some organization in Mexico runs afoul of the Trump administration, that becomes a lever where they can investigate to get to that organization and then punish them or target them for investigation. So, that could happen. I mean, we haven't seen that yet, but this is still very early. But the breadth of these networks makes it so that with enforcement, you can kind of enforce how it gives you a lot of leeway to enforce and target where you want to enforce based on what you're interested in. So I think that's kind of, that's really what we're looking at for like political changes, the economic changes. I think the biggest piece of this is just really the Sheinbaum administration, because of the U.S. government pressure, has a lot more leeway to go after these groups in a way that maybe there was some concern that President López Obrador would kind of step up and weigh in. But I think that she has enough political capital now because of this pressure, because of everything she's been doing, and her approval ratings are sky high because of the way she's reacted to the Trump economic engagement. So I think, really the big impact is just that the Sheinbaum administration they have some room now to do the policies that they feel like make sense.
Sure, that's really interesting. Thank you. I think just thinking about the empowerment they now have and how that could alter the situation. To take it a bit further out, I'd just like to ask what you think the possible regional ramifications of the declaration are for neighboring countries, kind of broader Latin America. How do you see the declaration impacting these areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same thing with the network. So you've got, these are very powerful organizations. You've got, Mexican cartel or transnational criminal organization envoys or operatives throughout the region, really throughout the world. You've got these folks moving around. So especially like in Colombia with the cocaine trafficking, they're buying cocaine down there, they're moving it up. You've got, representatives in Central America, really all over the place. This is a very broad kind of international, these are international, the biggest ones are very international organizations. They're not just Mexico, United States. You even see them in Europe and Asia, increasingly in Asia.
Yeah.
And then you've got a lot of flows now moving through like Brazil to Africa up to Europe. And then you've had even more recently, they've even had some of these semi-submersibles or fully submersibles in some cases, but they've had some of these semi-submersibles filled with drugs showing up in Europe, making like Atlantic crossings and whatnot. So if these networks are broad, like they're global, they're throughout the Western Hemisphere, and so if you're doing this terrorist network mapping and then you're targeting, then that way it gives you the ability then to start targeting these groups in other places. And most likely that's going to be more of this financial targeting, more of this, law enforcement investigation, all that stuff. It's not going to be, direct targeting, like military targeting or whatnot, but you could see that happening as well. And then all these same things apply, like you're going to see in Mexico with if they're linked to legitimate business, to illicit economy, to all these kind of things, then you could see the United States then reach out and start doing this kind of, well, sanctioning, OFAC sanctioning, going after finances, or potentially using this kind of material support to terrorism, authorities to try to go after groups throughout the region. And it's important to note that it wasn't just Mexican transnational criminal organizations that were labeled or that were designated as terrorist organizations. You've also got like MS-13, which is in Central America, and then you've got Tren de Aragua, TDA down in Venezuela. So, these groups are also operating, throughout the region, but you've got MS-13 mainly there in Central America, and then TDA in Venezuela, Colombia, moving up with their human trafficking and human smuggling operations. So then those also, if they're terrorist organizations, then they can be targeted as well. I don't think, there's some potential that with the terrorist designation and with this increased U.S. Activity in Mexico, really partnering with the Mexicans and going after these groups, that you could see a real degradation of the Mexican organizations, but I'm not I'm not confident that that's going to happen. I'm not sure if that's really going to. They're just very strong organizations, and like I said, you have this market, and as long as the market exists, they're going to continue to exist and try to fill it. You did see in the 90s this concerted effort by the Colombian government to go after the Medellin and Cali cartel, and with some U.S. support, and they basically dismantled those two organizations, which were the most powerful organizations at the time, and that led to a movement of kind of like the E-suite, CEO level executive functions of the drug trafficking world, mainly cocaine trafficking, moved into Mexico. And that's what super empowered these Mexican organizations. So I suppose hypothetically, you could have this pressure in Mexico really degrades these groups, and then kind of like the executive functions of of the largest types of cartels would move to other countries. But I think with the 2,000-mile border between Mexico and the United States, the fact that fentanyl is the main drug right now, flowing into Mexico and then flowing into the United States. It's not like with cocaine. It's a little different, and it would have to take a really concerted effort to displace the Mexican cartels as kind of the leading organizations in the drug market and the drug trade. So I don't really see that happening. You could see some shift in function if pressure really gets hard in Mexico. I'm doubtful that we get there, but you could see, like the balloon effect where you squeeze in one place and these groups kind of move somewhere else, or then power moves somewhere else. You could see that happen, but I'm not sure that I'm not really confident that that will happen. And certainly the designation only goes so far. Really, that's going to be just based on Mexican law enforcement pressure and Mexican, the Mexican government really going after these groups. And we haven't seen what I haven't seen the Mexican government do is put together, they have a strategy, but I haven't seen this kind of whole of government strategy. So you've really got a problem on both sides of the border where in the United States, they haven't really gone after, we don't have a comprehensive plan to go after drug use and go after local issues, where you're providing health care, you're providing good policing, good governance. Same thing in the Mexico side. Even if you get like Garcia Harfuch has his elite police organization and the military is really going after it, even if you're just arresting folks and you're targeting folks and you're removing some of the senior leaders, these kingpins, even some of the mid ranks, if you're not coming in with kind of a comprehensive government plan to bring in governance support, education, alternate business opportunities, then you're not going to see that change in Mexico also. So I'm not super positive. I'm not super bullish that any of this, especially the terrorist designation, is going to create this massive change in what we're seeing in the drug trafficking space or in the security space. So I think that's just kind of where we're at. I don't see like a huge change in Mexico, United States, or really in the region. I think we'll see more activity, but probably not like this revolutionary change in how we're engaging with this problem.
A final note on the question. I guess taking into account the increased uh, US activity in Latin America and now this new designation of FTOs on all of these organized crimes, do you think in any way this would signal like a greater intention of US presence in the region? Or does this have any ramifications on Latin American sovereignty?
Um, Yeah, well, I think the terrorist designation has been something they've been talking about for a really long time, and it's been debated for a long time whether it made sense or not. I think just if you step back from just the terrorist organization designation and look at just U.S. interest in the region as a whole, I think you're seeing a real focus by the Trump administration on the region. I mean, the Trump administration is zeroed in on the border, they're zeroed in on Mexico, and more than that, they're really focused on the hemisphere. I mean, you see this in the Trump administration and President Trump in particular, his discussions about you know taking control of Greenland, his discussions about the Panama Canal and regaining control of the Panama Canal. These are all kind of this is this different. I think people are still trying to figure out. They're still trying to grapple with what the Trump administration's foreign policy is. But it seems to be this idea of great powers have their sphere of influence, and you see this kind of return back to almost like 1800s late 1800s United States, where the sphere of influence is really the Western Hemisphere, and the United States is trying to be isolationist except within the hemisphere. And you've got Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State. His focus, one of his primary focus areas, has always been in his political career has been the hemisphere. You've got some senior folks within the State Department also with experience in the hemisphere. You can look at who they're assigning as ambassadors within region and just how they're focused in here. It does seem like the Western Hemisphere, and in particular Mexico, is a focus area. And the Trump administration Trump himself has made a lot of claims about sovereignty, about U.S. interests, he hasn't discounted the use of military force in region. So part of this is about the drug trade and about reducing fentanyl deaths and all of this. Some of this is about this concept of great powers and great powers, what great powers do, great power hemisphere, great power, spheres of influence. So I think, if you put this terrorist designation kind of in that bucket with the rest of this great power conceptualization that the Trump administration has, it kind of fits in there pretty nicely. And then what it also does with the authorities, if you're looking at it as the authorities as just hey, this is to go after narco traffickers, then maybe it doesn't make as much sense as if you look at it as this is some authorities that we can then use to expand what the U.S. government does in region and what the U.S. government can get into in region and how it partners with people and then where it can open doors to set conditions to do more things in the future. I think it gets very problematic. There's a lot of issues there, and I think nothing in foreign policy is as easy as it looks on paper. And I think we're already seeing a lot of these issues kind of as you look at what's going on with Panama and Greenland and all these kind of things. All these kind of claims are starting to come in contact with reality. But I think the terrorist designation, I think that's right. I think you could place it within this idea of this great power competition, great power sphere of influence, foreign policy that the Trump administration has.
All right, that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for such an insightful look into the legality of Mexican cartels. Thank you very much, Mr. Burgoyne, and yeah, that'll be it. I'll
Thank
be
you.
pausing
Thank
the
you.
recording. Yeah.